Daddy, save her! She's dying!
The white pillow clutched against Joyce Henry's chest was the only thing between her and the cold hardwood floor. Her vision blurred at the edges, the elegant gray walls of the master bedroom swimming like watercolors in rain. She could hear little Elma's voice, distant, frightened, calling for her daddy, but Joyce couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but surrender to the darkness pulling her under. She didn't hear Robert Buscher's footsteps pounding up the stairs, didn't see the exact moment his composed CEO facade shattered when he saw her there, his 7-year-old daughter kneeling beside the collapsed body of their housekeeper, tears streaming down her cherubic face. What Joyce would remember later, when she finally opened her eyes in the hospital, was the feeling of being lifted. Strong arms cradling her swollen body with a gentleness that made her chest ache. A voice, deep, commanding, afraid, cutting through the fog. "Stay with me, Joyce. Please, just stay with me." But it was what he did next, what he said in that waiting room with his daughter's hand in his, that would change everything. That would force them both to question everything they thought they knew about grief, guilt, and whether hearts that have been shattered can ever truly love again. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the darkness at 5 a.m., and Joyce Henry's hand found it by muscle memory alone. She lay there for a moment in the cramped studio apartment, listening to the radiator clank and hiss, feeling the baby shift and press against her ribs. Another day, another mountain to climb. She turned her head on the pillow, and there he was, Donald, frozen forever at 29 in that photograph on her nightstand. His construction company uniform was crisp, his smile wide and genuine, his eyes holding all the future they'd never have. Joyce reached out and traced his face with her fingertip, the glass cool beneath her touch. "Morning, baby," she whispered, the ritual as essential as breathing. "It's Tuesday, 26 weeks today." She placed her hand on her belly. "Your son's getting big. I felt him hiccup last night. He's strong, just like you." Her voice cracked slightly. "I'm being strong too, I promise. Strong enough for both of us." The photograph offered no reply, just that eternal smile that used to light up rooms and now only illuminated the cavern of her grief. By 5:45, Joyce was dressed in jeans and a loose sweater that barely disguised her growing belly. Her natural curls pulled back with the efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that beauty was a luxury she couldn't afford. The diner shift started at 6, the Buscher mansion at 2. Somewhere in between, she'd try to eat something, prop her swollen feet up for 10 minutes, pretend the exhaustion wasn't a living thing pressing down on her chest. The morning rush at Betty's diner was relentless. Coffee refills, breakfast orders shouted across grease-slicked griddles, tips counted in coins and crumpled singles. Joyce moved through it with practiced grace, her smile professional even as her lower back screamed in protest. A regular customer asked when she was due, and Joyce's answer was automatic. "August. I'm fine, thanks for asking." The lie was so smooth now she almost believed it herself. By 1:30, she was standing at the gates of the Buscher estate, the iron scrollwork as ornate as everything else in this world that wasn't hers. The mansion loomed ahead, all glass and stone and old money, the kind of house that appeared in magazines with titles like Architectural Digest that Joyce had only ever seen in waiting rooms. She entered through the service entrance, changed into her uniform, black dress, white apron, white collar, the costume of invisibility. In the mirror, she adjusted the white headband that kept her hair in place, and barely recognized the woman staring back. When had she become so tired? When had the light gone out of her own eyes? Robert Buscher was in his study when she arrived, visible through the half-open door. Joyce had worked for him for 8 months and could count on one hand the number of times he'd truly looked at her. He was handsome in that carved from marble way of men who'd never known hunger, never known fear. Tall, impeccably dressed even at home, dark hair just beginning to silver at the temples. But his eyes, those were what haunted her. Empty eyes in a living face, going through the motions of existing without ever truly being present. She'd heard the staff whisper about it, about Catherine Buscher dying 3 years ago during childbirth, about how Mr. Buscher had never been the same, about how the little girl was basically raising herself in that big house with only nannies and housekeepers for company. As if summoned by the thought, 7-year-old Elma appeared in the hallway, her light brown hair tangled, her blue dress wrinkled. The child's face lit up when she saw Joyce, the only face in this entire house that ever seemed to truly see her. Miss Joyce. Elma rushed forward, then stopped short, remembering the rules about proper behavior. Good afternoon. Joyce's heart cracked a little wider. Good afternoon, Miss Elma. How was school? Boring. We had to draw our families, and I didn't know what to draw because Mommy's not here anymore, and Daddy's always in his office, and The words tumbled out in that breathless way of children who'd been holding things in too long. Hey now, Joyce said softly, kneeling down despite the protest in her knees. You drew what felt true, didn't you? That's all anyone can do. Elma nodded, her eyes shimmering with tears she was too proud to shed. Then she wrapped her small arms around Joyce's neck in a fierce hug that lasted exactly 3 seconds before she pulled away and disappeared up the stairs. Joyce stood slowly, pressing one hand to her belly, the other to the wall for balance. The baby kicked, strong, insistent, alive. Donald's son, growing inside her, tethering her to a future she couldn't quite imagine. The afternoon passed in the rhythm of work, dusting surfaces already pristine, arranging flowers in crystal vases, preparing the dinner Mr. Buscher would eat alone in his study while Elma ate in the kitchen with whatever staff remained. But at 4 o'clock, Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, found Joyce in the hallway. Mr. Buscher wants you to sort through Mrs. Catherine's closet today, box everything up. He's finally ready to let it go, I suppose. The older woman's face was gentle with sympathy. Take your time with it, dear. I know it's not an easy task. The master bedroom was a shrine. Joyce could feel it the moment she stepped inside, Catherine's presence lingering like perfume in the silver-framed photographs, in the untouched cosmetics on the vanity, in the closet doors that stood open like the entrance to a tomb. Joyce approached slowly, reverently. Beautiful clothes hung in perfect rows, silks and cashmeres, designer labels, a life lived in luxury. She reached for the first dress when she heard it, a small, choked sound coming from deep inside the closet. Elma. The child was curled in the corner, clutching a cream-colored dress to her chest, her face buried in the fabric. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Joyce didn't think. She simply lowered herself to the floor, awkward with her belly but determined, and gathered the little girl into her arms. Elma clung to her desperately, the dam finally breaking. It doesn't smell like her anymore, Elma gasped between sobs. I tried and tried to remember, but it's gone. She's gone, and I can't even remember what she smelled like. Oh, sweetheart. Joyce rocked her gently, the way she imagined she'd rock her own son. That's not where she lives, baby girl. Not in a dress. She lives in your eyes. They're the exact same blue. In your laugh. In the way you tilt your head when you're thinking. Just like in those pictures. She's in you, Elma. Always. Joyce began to hum without thinking, an old lullaby her grandmother used to sing, and slowly Elma's breathing settled, her grip loosened. The child's head rested heavy against Joyce's shoulder, exhausted from the weight of grief too large for such small bones to carry. Neither of them heard Robert approach. Neither saw him freeze in the doorway, his briefcase still in hand, his expression cracking like ice in spring thaw. He stood there, watching this woman, this housekeeper he barely knew, offer his daughter the comfort he'd been too paralyzed by his own grief to give. When Joyce finally looked up and met his eyes, something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, the wordless communication of two people who'd both learned what it meant to keep breathing after your heart stops beating. That evening, as Joyce began packing the clothes into boxes, Robert appeared in the doorway again. Stay for a moment, he said, his voice rough with disuse. Please. Joyce straightened, her hands smoothing her apron automatically. Mister. Buscher stepped into his late wife's room for what was clearly the first time in years, his movements careful, as if the space might shatter. "I can't do this," he said finally, gesturing vaguely at the closet. "I thought 3 years would be enough time." "It isn't." Joyce considered him, this man who had everything money could buy and nothing that mattered. "I packed my husband's work clothes 6 months after the accident," she said quietly. "Kept one flannel shirt that smelled like him. I wore it until the scent faded, cried myself sick when it finally did." Robert's eyes found hers, and for the first time, she saw him truly look at her. "But I had to let the rest go," Joyce continued, her voice steady despite the tears threatening. "Keeping everything didn't bring him back. It just kept me frozen, kept me living in the past instead of in the present. And Donald." Her hand moved unconsciously to her belly. "Donald would have hated that. He'd want me to live. Really live. Not just survive." The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared grief, and the weight of truths neither wanted to face. "How do you do it?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you keep going?" Joyce met his eyes, grief recognizing grief, and for the first time in 8 months, neither of them looked away. "You just do," she said softly, "one breath at a time, until one day the breathing doesn't hurt quite as much." The fluorescent lights in Dr. Patel's office were unforgiving, casting everything in sharp relief. The medical posters on the wall, the ultrasound machine humming in the corner, Joyce's face as she listened to the diagnosis she'd been running from for months. "Severe stress, malnutrition, and early signs of preeclampsia," Dr. Patel said, her voice kind but firm. "Mrs. Henry, you're putting yourself and your baby at serious risk. Do you have support at home? Family? The father?" Joyce opened her mouth to give her practiced answer, the one about being fine, about managing, about not needing anyone, but Robert's voice cut through the room before she could form the words. "Yes, she has support." Joyce's head whipped toward him, shock and something like anger flashing in her eyes. He sat in the chair beside the examination table, still in his suit from a morning meeting he'd rescheduled, his expression brooking no argument. "Mr. Buscher." "She has support," he repeated, this time looking directly at Joyce. "Whatever she needs." The drive back to the estate was thick with tension. Joyce stared out the window, her jaw set, her hands protective over her belly. Robert gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, waiting for the explosion he could feel building. It came the moment they pulled through the gates. "You had no right." Joyce's voice was low, controlled, deadly. "No right to speak for me, to make promises. You were going to lie to her." Robert put the car in park and turned to face her. "You were going to tell her you were fine when you're clearly not. That's my choice to make. Not when it affects your child. Not when I've watched you work yourself to the bone for 8 months and been too blind to see it." Joyce pushed open the car door, struggled out with more force than grace. "I don't need your charity, Mr. Buscher. I don't need you to rescue me like I'm some damsel in distress who can't take care of herself. This isn't about charity." Robert's voice rose as he followed her toward the house. "This is about basic human decency, about not watching someone destroy themselves out of pride." She whirled on him, tears of frustration glittering in her eyes. "You don't understand. I can't. I won't be dependent on anyone. I won't be another obligation you take on because it makes you feel better about." She stopped herself, but the words hung between them anyway. "About your own losses, about the family you couldn't save." The silence was deafening. "The guest house," Robert said finally, his voice rough. "Move into the guest house, temporarily. Continue light work only, and I mean light. No more double shifts. No more pretending you're not 6 months pregnant and barely keeping food down." He held up a hand when she started to protest. "Let me make up for not noticing earlier, for not paying attention when I should have." Joyce looked at him for a long moment, reading something in his face that made her anger deflate into exhaustion. "Temporary," she said quietly. "And I pay rent." "Absolutely not. Then I work for it. Light work, like you said, but I earn my keep." Robert wanted to argue, but he recognized the steel in her spine, the same strength that had kept her upright all these months. "Fine, but if Dr. Patel says bed rest, all bets are off." The ghost of a smile touched her lips. Deal. That night, lying in the guest house bedroom that was nicer than any place she'd ever lived, Joyce couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft, the sheets too expensive, or the entire situation too surreal. She'd propped Donald's photograph on the nightstand, and now she stared at it in the darkness, guilt gnawing at her insides. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I said I'd be strong enough alone. I know I promised to do this by myself, the way you would have wanted." Her hand moved to her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements. "But I'm so tired, Donald. And he's Mr. Buscher. He's just being kind. That's all. There's nothing wrong with accepting help, right?" The photograph offered no absolution, no comfort, just Donald's frozen smile and the crushing weight of promises she wasn't sure she could keep anymore. "I don't feel anything," she insisted to the darkness, to the ghost of her husband, to herself. "When he steadies my elbow, or opens doors, or looks at me with those sad eyes, I don't feel anything." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Across the grounds in the main house, Robert stood in Catherine's bedroom for the second time in 3 years. He'd come seeking what? Permission, forgiveness, the ghost of his wife to tell him he wasn't losing his mind. He tried to summon her face, the exact shade of her eyes, the way her nose crinkled when she laughed, but the details kept slipping away like water through his fingers. Instead, unbidden, he thought of Joyce's smile when Elma had shown her a drawing earlier, the way she'd hummed while arranging flowers in the front hall yesterday, the quiet strength in her voice when she'd said, "I earn my keep. I'm not replacing you," he said aloud to the empty room. "I'm not. She needs help. And Elma needs." What? What did Elma need that he hadn't been able to give her? The answer came swift and damning. Warmth, life, someone who wasn't half dead themselves. Robert sank onto the edge of the bed Catherine's side and dropped his head into his hands. His chest ached with a confusion he couldn't name, a guilt he couldn't shake, and underneath it all, the faintest flicker of something he hadn't felt in 3 years, the desire to wake up tomorrow. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm that felt both natural and dangerous. Mornings found Elma racing to the guest house to collect Joyce for breakfast, chattering about school and friends and the piano piece she was learning. Afternoons, after Joyce completed her shortened work duties, Elma would insist on teaching her the piano, their laughter drifting through the house like something that had been missing. Robert found himself inventing reasons to be home, a conference call he could take from his study, paperwork that absolutely required his attention. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. He wanted to hear that laughter, wanted to stand in doorways and watch Joyce braid Elma's hair with the casual tenderness of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before, wanted to see his daughter's face light up with joy, instead of the careful blankness she'd worn for 3 years. The thunderstorm came on a Wednesday night, violent and sudden. Robert woke to thunder that rattled the windows and Elma's scream cutting through the darkness. He was in the hallway in seconds, but Joyce was already there, her hair loose around her shoulders, wearing an oversized t-shirt that couldn't quite hide her pregnant belly, her face creased with concern. Their eyes met in the dim light, and without words they moved together toward Elma's room. The little girl was sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face, clutching her teddy bear like a lifeline. "The thunder sounds like the machines," she gasped. "The ones in the hospital when Mommy." "Shh, baby girl." Joyce sat on one side of the bed while Robert took the other, and together they created a cocoon of safety around the frightened child. "You're safe. We're right here." "Tell me a story," Elma pleaded, her voice small, not about princesses, about something real. So Robert told her about the time Catherine tried to bake him a birthday cake and somehow managed to set water on fire. And Joyce told her about when Donald brought home a stray puppy he'd found on a construction site, even though their apartment didn't allow pets. And they'd had to sneak it in and out for walks like tiny criminals. They traded stories, back and forth memories of the people they'd loved, the moments that had mattered, and slowly Elma's breathing evened out, her eyes growing heavy. At some point, Robert's hand had moved to rest on the blanket. At some point, Joyce's hand had found its way there too. When their fingers touched, neither pulled away. They sat like that long after Elma fell asleep, their hands barely connected but the contact electric, neither willing to be the first to break whatever fragile thing was building between them. It was close to midnight when Robert finally found Joyce in the garden, sitting on the stone bench near the rose bushes. She was crying silently, staring at something in her hands, the grainy black and white image of an ultrasound. He should have left, should have given her privacy. Instead, he found himself walking toward her, sitting down, the space between them both too close and not close enough. "This is all I have left of him," Joyce whispered, not looking up. "This baby. This one last piece of Donald. And I'm terrified I'm going to mess it up. That I'm going to fail him like I've failed at everything else. That I'm going to be alone and inadequate and—" Her voice broke completely. "You talked to him," Robert said quietly. It wasn't a question. Joyce's head snapped up, her eyes wide with something like shame. "You think I'm crazy? Number one. I set out Catherine's coffee cup some mornings. Earl Grey, 2 sugars, splash of cream. I make it exactly how she liked it and set it on her side of the table. Then I pour it down the sink before anyone sees." He laughed, but it came out choked. "So no, Joyce. I don't think you're crazy." She stared at him, and he saw his own devastation reflected back. "I held her while she died," he heard himself say, words he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. "She was hemorrhaging and the doctors were trying everything, and she looked at me and said, 'Take care of our baby.' And all I could think was that I'd killed her. That if I'd never gotten her pregnant, if I'd insisted on the C-section earlier, if I'd done 1,000 things differently." "Robert." His name on her lips stopped him cold. Not Mr. Buscher. Robert. "It wasn't your fault, wasn't it?" His voice cracked. "Just like it's not my fault that my daughter spent the last 3 years essentially alone because I was too busy being dead myself to notice she needed me." Joyce's hand found his deliberate this time. "No accident. No excuse. I understand," she whispered. And God help him. He knew she did. Knew it in the way she held his hand like it was something precious. Knew it in the tears streaming down both their faces. Knew it in the way they sat there in the garden under the stars. 2 people who'd been drowning separately, finally finding someone who could breathe underwater too. They didn't speak. Didn't need to. They simply sat, hands clasped, crying quietly for everything they'd lost and everything they were terrified to find. And for the first time in years, neither of them felt quite so alone. The morning Joyce mentioned craving peach cobbler, something her grandmother used to make, Robert appeared in the kitchen that evening with a recipe pulled up on his tablet and ingredients spread across the counter like a challenge he was determined to master. "You don't have to." Joyce started from her seat at the kitchen island, where she'd been sorting through meal plans. "I want to learn," Robert interrupted, already measuring flour with the intense concentration he usually reserved for board meetings. Besides, how hard can it be? 45 minutes later, the kitchen smelled like heaven and looked like a disaster zone. Robert had flour in his hair and peach juice on his shirt sleeve, but when he pulled the cobbler from the oven, golden and bubbling, his face held something Joyce hadn't seen before. Pride. Simple, uncomplicated joy in doing something with his own hands. When Joyce took her first bite, her eyes closed and tears slipped down her cheeks. "It tastes like home," she whispered. Robert watched her, something shifting in his chest. "Good," he said softly. "That's good." These moments accumulated like interest in a savings account, small deposits that grew into something substantial, before either quite realized what was happening. Joyce, finding Robert's reading glasses on the patio table and bringing them to his study with a soft smile that made him lose his train of thought mid-conference call. Elma insisting Joyce join them for Friday movie night, the 3 of them squeezed onto the couch with popcorn and blankets. Robert's hand on Joyce's back, steadying her as she navigated the stairs with her growing belly. Joyce humming while she arranged flowers, the sound filling spaces that had been silent for too long. They were falling into rhythms that felt like family, and the realization was both beautiful and terrifying. But the guilt came in waves, relentless as a tide. Joyce woke gasping in the darkness of the guest house, Donald's voice still echoing in her ears. In the dream, he'd been standing in the doorway of their old apartment, watching her pack his clothes into boxes. "Already replacing me?" he'd asked, and the disappointment in his voice had cut deeper than any knife. "Did I mean so little that you could forget me this easily?" "No," Joyce sobbed into her pillow, reaching for his photograph on the nightstand. "Donald, no. I'm not forgetting. I could never forget." But even as she said it, she realized with horror that she'd gone an entire day without thinking about him. A whole day consumed by laughter with Elma, by the way Robert's eyes crinkled when he smiled, by the dangerous warmth growing in her chest. The dreams came more frequently after that. Donald asking if their love had meant anything at all. Donald holding their unborn son, saying, "You're giving him to another man, aren't you?" Donald's face when he'd asked her to marry him, the hope in his eyes that now felt like an accusation. She apologized to his photo every morning, her litany of guilt. "I still love you. I do. You have to know that. This doesn't mean I'm not." But the words tangled on her tongue because she didn't know what it meant anymore. One afternoon, washing dishes in the main house kitchen, Joyce caught herself humming. It took her a moment to place the melody. It was the jazz standard Robert had played in his study yesterday, something instrumental and complex that she'd never heard before. Not a song from her past, not something she'd shared with Donald, something entirely Robert's. The dish slipped from her hands and shattered in the sink. She stared at the broken pieces, her reflection fractured in the soapy water, and the truth crashed over her with devastating clarity. She was falling for Robert Buscher. Not just accepting his help or being grateful for his kindness. Falling. The real kind. The dangerous kind. The kind that made her think about futures instead of just getting through today. "Oh God," she whispered, gripping the counter. "Donald, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Robert stood at Catherine's grave for the first time in 4 months, fresh lilies in his hand, her favorite. The marble headstone was exactly as he'd commissioned it. Elegant, understated, her name and dates and the words, beloved wife and mother. But standing there now, he felt like an actor who'd forgotten his lines. "Elma's doing well in school," he said to the cold stone. "She made honor roll. You'd be proud." His voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. "The company's expanding into Southeast Asia. The board is happy with the projections." He tried to summon the crushing grief that had defined him for 3 years, but it felt distant now, like a storm viewed from safe harbor, and underneath the guilt of that realization was something worse. He couldn't quite remember Catherine's voice, couldn't recall the exact shade of her eyes without calling up a mental photograph, but he could remember exactly how Joyce had looked yesterday, laughing at something Elma said, sunlight catching in her hair. He swallowed hard. "There's someone. No, not someone. Joyce, the housekeeper. But he couldn't finish. Couldn't tell his dead wife about the woman who was making him want to be alive again. The omission felt like the worst betrayal of all, worse than the feelings themselves. Robert left the flowers and walked back to his car feeling like a stranger, like he'd been visiting someone else's wife, someone else's grief. The thought made him sick with guilt and relief in equal measure. That evening, Elma found Joyce in the garden, reading a pregnancy book in the fading light. The little girl climbed onto the bench beside her, tucking herself under Joyce's arm with the casual confidence of a child who'd finally found someone safe. "Miss Joyce." Elma's voice was small, uncertain. "Can I ask you something?" "Always, sweetheart. Daddy says Mommy's in heaven, watching over us. Do you think she can see us? Do you think?" Elma's blue eyes. Catherine's eyes lifted to Joyce's face. "Do you think she's happy I have you now?" Joyce's heart cracked clean through. Here she was, sitting in Catherine's garden, holding Catherine's daughter, falling in love with Catherine's husband. An intruder in every sense of the word, displacing a ghost who'd never done anything wrong except die. "Oh, Elma." Joyce's voice shook. "Your mommy loves you so much. She's always with you, in your heart. And I'm not trying to replace her. I could never." "I know." Elma snuggled closer. "But maybe you could just be you. And that would be enough." Joyce couldn't answer through the tears. Friday night dinner had become a tradition, the 3 of them around the dining room table instead of Robert in his study and Elma in the kitchen. Robert had made lasagna from a recipe Joyce had mentioned, and Elma was telling an elaborate story about her art teacher, her hands gesturing wildly. Joyce laughed at something, really laughed, the kind that lit up her whole face, and Robert felt his chest constrict with dangerous tenderness. Elma was giggling, stealing pieces of garlic bread. The chandelier cast warm light over the scene, and for a moment it was so perfectly domestic, so achingly normal, that Robert forgot to guard his expression. "This is fun," Elma announced, reaching for her milk. "Like we're a real family." The words dropped into the comfortable atmosphere like a stone into still water. The ripples spread outward in silence. Joyce's smile froze on her face. Robert's hand tightened around his fork. Elma looked between them, confusion clouding her features. "Did I say something wrong?" "No, sweetheart," Joyce managed. "Not at all." But when her eyes met Robert's across the table, The look that passed between them held everything they'd been trying not to acknowledge. Longing, guilt, fear, want. The ghost of Catherine and the ghost of Donald sitting at the table with them, invisible witnesses to their betrayal. That night, well past midnight, a knock sounded on the guest house door. Joyce opened it to find Robert still dressed from dinner, his face haggard in the porch light. "We need to talk," he said. They sat on opposite ends of the small couch, the distance between them both too far and not far enough. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I don't know how to do this," Robert finally said, staring at his hands. "I don't even know if I should want to. Catherine's been gone 3 years, and I thought I'd be alone forever. I thought I was supposed to be. Every time I look at you," Joyce whispered, "I feel like I'm betraying Donald, like I'm breaking a promise I made at his graveside, that I'd love him forever, that I'd be strong enough alone. And every time I think about you," Robert continued, his voice rough, "I feel like I'm erasing Catherine. Like if I let myself feel this, whatever this is, then I'm admitting she's really gone, that I'm moving on. And what kind of person moves on from the mother of his child?" Joyce's hands twisted in her lap. "I dream about him, Donald. He asks me if I've forgotten him, if our love meant so little that I could replace him so easily, and I wake up apologizing to his photograph like I've committed some unforgivable sin." "I couldn't tell Catherine about you," Robert confessed. "I went to her grave today and I talked about Elma, about work, and about everything except the one thing that mattered, because saying it out loud would make it real, would make me the kind of man who falls for someone else while his wife's barely cold in the ground. She's been gone 3 years, Robert, and Donald's been gone almost 2. Does time make it less of a betrayal?" "I don't know." Joyce's voice broke. "I don't know anything anymore, except that I'm tired of feeling guilty for wanting to be happy, for wanting to wake up and not immediately drown in grief, for wanting." She looked at him finally, really looked at him. "For wanting you." The confession hung between them, raw and terrifying. Robert's hands clenched into fists on his knees. "So what do we do?" he asked hoarsely. "How do we reconcile this with everything we owe to the people we lost?" "I don't know. Neither do I." He looked at her across the small distance that felt like miles. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Joyce. I can't stop imagining what it would be like to have this." He gestured vaguely at the space between them to have something real again. "And that terrifies me more than anything I've ever faced." They sat in the heavy silence, the truth finally spoken but offering no solutions, no absolution. Just the stark acknowledgement that they were both falling off a cliff and couldn't decide whether to reach for each other or let themselves crash alone. Joyce's hand moved slightly on the cushion between them. Robert's fingers twitched, yearning to close that distance, but neither moved. Neither touched. They simply sat with the weight of what had been said, 2 people loving ghosts and each other in equal, impossible measure. "I should go," Robert finally said, but he didn't move. "You should," Joyce agreed, but she didn't look away. And in the space between what they should do and what they wanted, the truth settled around them like a shroud. There was no going back from this moment, no pretending they hadn't said the words, no returning to the careful distance they'd maintained. They had crossed a line, and neither knew if it was the bravest or most foolish thing they'd ever done. The morning after the conversation, Joyce stood at the kitchen counter preparing breakfast with mechanical precision. She heard Robert's footsteps before she saw him, had learned to recognize his gait, another small intimacy she catalogued with shame, and her spine straightened automatically. "Good morning, Mr. Buscher," she said, not turning around. The formality felt like armor, brittle and necessary. Robert paused mid-step. Mr. Buscher. They'd been Robert and Joyce for weeks now, and the reversion to employer-employee distance felt like a slap. "Good morning," he replied carefully, pouring coffee he didn't want just to have something to do with his hands. They moved around each other like dancers learning new choreography, acutely aware of every inch of space between them. When Joyce reached for the cream at the same moment Robert did, their fingers brushed, barely a second of contact, and both jerked back as if burned. The awareness crackled between them, electric and dangerous. "Excuse me," Joyce murmured, clutching her coffee cup. "Of course." Robert stepped back, giving her wide berth, and hated himself for noticing the way her hand trembled slightly as she poured. Elma looked between them with a child's confusion. "Why are you being weird?" she asked, her 7-year-old bluntness cutting through the tension. "We're not being weird, sweetheart," Joyce said too quickly. "You are. You're talking like strangers." Robert and Joyce exchanged a glance, brief, loaded, before both looked away. Everything and nothing had changed. They'd acknowledged the truth, and now that truth sat between them like a third presence, impossible to ignore. Over the following days, Robert threw himself into work with renewed intensity. Conference calls that could have been emails, meetings that didn't require his physical presence but got it anyway, strategy sessions that ran late into the evening, anything to avoid the guest house, the gardens, the spaces where Joyce might be. But he found himself cutting meetings short to be home for dinner, found excuses to check on her. Had she taken her prenatal vitamins? Did she need anything from town? Was she feeling all right? His executive assistant noticed the shift, the way his entire schedule now revolved around being home by 6 o'clock. His world had reoriented around Joyce's gravity, and fighting it felt like swimming against a riptide. Joyce tried desperately to maintain boundaries. She arrived each morning in her uniform, hair pulled back severely, movements efficient and professional. Called him Mr. Buscher, even when he winced at the formality. Kept conversations brief and task-oriented. But her body betrayed her at every turn. The way her face transformed when Robert entered a room, lighting up before she could school it into neutrality. The unconscious gesture she developed of touching her belly whenever he was near, as if introducing him to the baby growing inside her. The way her eyes followed him when she thought he wasn't looking, hungry and guilty in equal measure. One evening, Elma came home from school clutching a piece of construction paper with the intensity of someone carrying treasure. "We had to draw our families," she announced, spreading the picture on the dining room table with obvious pride. Robert looked over her shoulder, and the world tilted sideways. 4 stick figures held hands across the page, a tall one labeled Daddy, a smaller one with yellow yarn hair labeled Me, a figure with brown skin and a belly labeled Miss Joyce, and a tiny bundle labeled The Baby. The air left his lungs in a rush. This was his daughter's family, not Catherine, preserved in photographs and memory. This living, breathing, impossible configuration of people who'd found each other in grief. Joyce appeared in the doorway, saw the picture, and went pale. "Elma, that's lovely, sweetheart, but her voice cracked. "Excuse me." She fled, and Robert heard the guest house door close with awful finality. He tucked Elma into bed with distracted kisses and gentle reassurances that yes, the drawing was beautiful, before making his way across the darkened grounds. Light spilled from the guest house windows, and through them he could see Joyce moving back and forth, packing. Robert didn't knock. He simply opened the door and stopped short at the scene before him. Suitcases open on the bed, clothes being folded with shaking hands, tears streaming down Joyce's face as she worked with frantic determination. "What are you doing?" His voice came out hoarse. What I should have done weeks ago. Joyce didn't look at him, just kept folding. "I'm leaving. Tomorrow morning. I'll work until you find a replacement, but I can't live here anymore." "Joyce." "I'm confusing her, Robert." His name broke from her lips like a confession. "I'm confusing Elma. I'm confusing myself," she thinks. Joyce gestured helplessly toward the main house. "She drew us as a family. But that's not what this is. I'm the help who overstayed her welcome and started playing house with a life that isn't mine. What if I want it to be your life?" The words dropped into the room like a bomb. Joyce's hands stilled on the shirt she'd been folding, her entire body going rigid. "Don't." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Please don't say things you don't mean." Robert crossed the room in 3 strides, taking the shirt from her hands and forcing her to look at him. "I mean every word. What if I want this to be your life? What if I want you here, not as an employee, not as some temporary arrangement, but as—" He couldn't finish, couldn't name what they were becoming. Joyce shook her head violently, backing away. "You're lonely. I'm here, and convenient and pregnant, and you're projecting some kind of— Don't." Now his voice was sharp, cutting. "Don't diminish this. Don't diminish what I feel." "What you feel." Joyce's laugh was bitter, broken. "You don't even know what you feel. You're still in love with your dead wife." "Yes," the word exploded from him. "Yes, I loved my wife. I love my wife. Catherine gave me Elma, and I will never stop being grateful for that. I will never stop honoring her memory. But she's gone, Joyce. She's been gone for 3 years. And I'm still here." His voice dropped to something raw and desperate. And so are you. And I don't know what that means or where it goes, but I know that for the first time since Catherine died, I want to wake up tomorrow. I want to see what happens next. You did that. Joyce crumpled, the strength that had carried her through Donald's death and months of single pregnancy finally giving out. She sank onto the bed, sobs shaking her whole body. I can't, she gasped. I can't be that for you. I can't be the reason you move on because I'm terrified, Robert. I'm terrified that Donald is watching and he's disappointed in me. That I'm weak for needing you. That I'm a terrible person for developing feelings for my employer. For a white man from a different world. For anyone who isn't Donald. Robert knelt before her, his hands hovering over her knees, not touching, asking permission. May I? She nodded, and he took her hands in his, grounding them both. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Robert said fiercely. Strength isn't doing everything alone, Joyce. It's having the courage to accept help, to be vulnerable, to risk your heart even when it's already been shattered. He waited until she looked at him, until their eyes met. And I know, that Donald and Catherine loved us enough to want us to be happy, even if that happiness looks different than we planned. How can you know that? Joyce's voice was small, desperate. Because I would want it for Catherine. If our positions were reversed, if I'd been the one who died and she'd survived, I would want her to find love again, to find joy, to not spend the rest of her life in a tomb of grief I'd accidentally built for her. His thumbs traced circles on the backs of her hands. Would you have wanted Donald to be alone forever? The question hung between them. Joyce closed her eyes, and Robert could see her really considering it, imagining Donald alive and her dead, imagining him finding someone else. No, she finally whispered. I'd want him to be happy. I'd want him to live fully, to love again, to not let my death destroy him. Then why? Robert asked gently. Do you think he'd want less for you? The sob that tore from Joyce was different this time. Not despair, but release. Years of guilt and self-punishment pouring out in hot tears that soaked into Robert's shirt as he pulled her close, holding her while she shook. I'm scared, she confessed into his shoulder. I'm so scared of forgetting him, of our love meaning nothing, of people thinking I didn't love him enough if I can love someone else. Love doesn't work like that. Robert's voice was rough with his own unshed tears. It doesn't run out. It doesn't replace. It just expands. Gets bigger. You loving me, he paused, testing the words, doesn't make you love Donald less. Just like me loving you doesn't erase Catherine. Joyce pulled back enough to look at him, her eyes red and swollen, but seeing him clearly. You love me. Robert's heart thundered in his chest. There it was. The truth he'd been dancing around, the admission that changed everything. Yes, he said simply. I love you. I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. And it terrifies me because I swore I'd never feel this way about anyone else. But here we are. Fresh tears spilled down Joyce's cheeks, but she was almost smiling through them. I love you too, and I feel so guilty for it I can barely breathe sometimes. Then we'll breathe through it together. Robert cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away tears. We'll honor Donald and Catherine by living the kind of full, brave, loving lives they would have wanted for us. We'll teach Elma that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, expands, continues. Joyce leaned into his touch, her hands coming up to cover his. What if we're wrong? What if this is just grief and loneliness masquerading as something real? Then we'll figure it out, together. Robert rested his forehead against hers. But Joyce, I don't think we're wrong. I think we found each other because we were the only ones who could understand. The only ones who knew what it meant to keep breathing after your heart stops. They sat like that, foreheads touching, breathing in sync, two broken people acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new from the pieces. The baby, Joyce said eventually. Donald's baby. Does that change things for you? That baby is a gift, Robert said firmly. A piece of a man you loved, a man who made you who you are. How could that be anything but precious? Joyce's laugh was watery but genuine. You're too good to be true. I'm really not. I'm a workaholic who's been emotionally dead for 3 years and has no idea how to do this. But I want to try. With you. She pulled back enough to look at the suitcases on the bed, the half-packed evidence of her panic. I was really going to leave. I know. Thank you for stopping me." Robert helped her to her feet, steadying her as she found her balance. "Always," he promised. And in that moment, with her hand in his and the future uncertain but no longer quite so terrifying, they both believed it might actually be true. The days following their confession existed in a strange, suspended reality. Robert and Joyce moved around each other with newfound tenderness, but neither knew what they were doing. Not quite together, not quite apart. Every interaction felt weighted with significance, passing each other in the hallway, sharing coffee in the morning, the way Robert's hand would hover near the small of her back before he remembered himself and pulled away. The tension was unbearable and beautiful, like standing on the edge of a cliff and not knowing whether to jump or step back to safety. Elma watched them with knowing eyes far too old for 7, a small smile playing at her lips whenever she caught them looking at each other. She'd started leaving her drawings around the house, always the same 4 figures, always holding hands like breadcrumbs leading them toward the truth she'd already accepted. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, while Robert was at the office and Elma at school, that Joyce finally called her sister. She'd been putting it off for weeks, afraid of the questions, the judgment, the reality that speaking it aloud would make it all real. "Girl, you sound exhausted," Marlene said without preamble. "What's going on?" And Joyce, sitting in the garden with her hand on her swollen belly, broke down and told her everything. About the collapse, the guest house, Robert's kindness that had become something more, the guilt that ate at her every time she looked at Donald's picture. The silence on the other end stretched so long Joyce thought the call had dropped. Then Marlene spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "Donald loved you more than anything in this world. You know that, right?" "I know," Joyce whispered. "Then answer me this. Do you really think he'd want you raising his baby alone and miserable when there's a good man ready to stand with you? Do you think Donald was that selfish, that small?" "No, but no buts. Listen to me, Joyce. When Donald died, I watched you almost die too. You were breathing, walking around, but you weren't living. And now, for the first time in almost 2 years, I hear life in your voice again. I hear hope. You think I'm going to tell you to run from that Donald would want you to?" Joyce couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. "Love doesn't run out, baby sister. It multiplies. You loving this Robert doesn't mean you love Donald less. It means your heart is big enough to hold both. And Donald," Marlene's voice broke slightly, "Donald would be so proud of you for being brave enough to try again." After they hung up, Joyce sat in the garden for a long time, one hand on her belly, the other clutching her phone with Donald's photo on the screen. The baby kicked, strong and insistent, and she whispered, "Did you hear that, little one? Your daddy loved us enough to want us happy, even if he can't be here to see it." That same evening, Robert sat alone in his study, surrounded by 3 years of carefully avoided memories. He'd finally brought down the box from the attic, the one containing Catherine's letters, journals, or the ephemera of their life together that he'd been too afraid to touch. His hands shook as he sifted through the contents, birthday cards in her looping handwriting, ticket stubs from their honeymoon, a pressed flower from their wedding bouquet, and then, at the bottom, an envelope he didn't recognize. The letter inside was dated a week before Catherine's first pregnancy test came back positive. He remembered that conversation, late at night, both of them giddy with possibility and terrified of all that could go wrong. Catherine had been pragmatic even then, insisting they talk through the worst-case scenarios. He'd forgotten she'd written this. Or maybe he'd never known she had. Robert's eyes burned as he read her familiar handwriting. "My dearest Robert, if you're reading this, then something went wrong. The pregnancy we're about to start trying for didn't go as planned, and I'm not there to see our baby grow up. I'm not there to see you grow old. And I'm so, so sorry. But here's what I need you to promise me. Promise you'll live. Really, truly live. Not the half-life of going through motions. Not the shadow existence of someone waiting to die. Live. Love Elma with everything you have. Tell her about me. But don't let me become a ghost that haunts your house. Let her see you happy, because that's how she'll learn that joy is possible even after loss. Love again if you can. Please, Robert. Don't let my death be your prison. I know you'll feel guilty. You're you. You'll probably torture yourself with it. But I'm giving you permission right now. If someone comes along who makes you laugh again, who reminds you what it feels like to be alive, don't you dare push them away because of me. Let my death be proof that life is precious and short and should be grabbed with both hands. Live fully. Love deeply. Make every day count. That's what I want for you. That's what I'd want, even if I were there beside you. All my love, always and forever. Catherine. Robert's breath came in ragged gasps, tears streaming down his face as he read the letter again and again. Permission. She'd given him permission 3 years ago, before either of them knew he'd need it. Before Joyce existed in his world. Before everything fell apart and slowly, painfully, began to rebuild itself into something new. He pressed the letter to his chest and let himself cry. For Catherine. For the life they'd planned. For the man he'd been before grief hollowed him out. And underneath the grief, unlike green shoots through concrete, was something else. Gratitude. For this gift she'd left him. For the love that had been big enough to want his happiness even from beyond the grave. The call came at 2 a.m., shattering Robert's fitful sleep. Mrs. Patterson's panicked voice on the phone. It's Joyce. She's in pain. The ambulance is on the way. Robert was dressed and downstairs before he fully processed the words, arriving at the guest house just as the paramedics loaded Joyce onto a stretcher. Her face was contorted with pain, one hand clutching her belly, the other reaching for him instinctively. Robert, the baby. It's too early. I'm here. He grabbed her hand, climbed into the ambulance without asking permission. I'm right here. The hospital was a blur of harsh lights and antiseptic smells and doctors speaking in urgent tones about blood pressure and early labor and preeclampsia. Joyce's numbers were dangerously high, contractions coming regularly at 34 weeks. Too early. Not safe yet. Robert held her hand through it all, ignoring the curious looks from nurses who clearly wondered about the white billionaire clutching the hand of his black housekeeper, whispering encouragement through each contraction. You're doing so well, he told her, brushing sweat-dampened hair from her forehead. You're so brave, Joyce. So strong. Tell me, she gasped between contractions. Tell me about Elma, about when she was born. So Robert talked, his voice steady, even as his heart raced with terror. He told her about Catherine's labor, 23 hours, stubborn as their daughter would prove to be. About how Catherine had laughed even through the pain, made jokes with the nurses, squeezed his hand so hard she left bruises. About the moment Elma was born, tiny and perfect, and screaming her arrival to the world. Catherine was so strong, he said softly, just like you. You're both the strongest people I've ever known. Hours crawled by. The doctors administered medications, monitored vitals, worked to stop the labor that had started too soon. And slowly, miraculously, Joyce's blood pressure began to drop. The contractions spaced out, weakened, finally stopped. The baby's stable, Dr. Patel said, relief evident in her voice. We're not out of the woods yet, but for now you're both okay. Joyce sagged back against the pillows, exhausted beyond measure. Robert kept holding her hand, unable to let go even as the immediate crisis passed. I'm scared, Joyce whispered when they were finally alone, her voice small in the dim hospital room. Not just of the baby coming early. I'm scared of this. Of us. Of wanting you when I should still only want him. Robert lifted her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I'm scared too, he admitted. Terrified, actually. But you know what scares me more? The half-life I was living before you. Going through the motions, emotionally dead, just existing instead of living. You brought color back to a world that had gone gray, Joyce. You made me want to wake up in the morning. And yes, it's terrifying and complicated, and we have no idea what we're doing. But I'd rather be scared with you than safely numb without you. Joyce's eyes filled with fresh tears. What if we're dishonoring them? What if Donald and Catherine wouldn't understand? I think they would. Robert thought of Catherine's letter, folded in his pocket now like a talisman. I know they would. Because they loved us, and people who truly love want the ones they love to be happy. Exhaustion finally claimed Joyce, her eyes drifting closed, her breathing evening out into sleep. Robert watched her for a long moment, then carefully extracted his hand and stepped into the hallway. The hospital corridor was empty at 4 a.m., fluorescent lights humming overhead. Robert pulled out his phone and scrolled to a number he hadn't called in 2 years. Dr. Morrison, his therapist from right after Catherine died, before Robert had convinced himself he didn't need help, that he could handle the grief alone. The voicemail picked up. Dr. Morrison, this is Robert Buscher. I'd like to schedule an appointment, as soon as possible. I'm ready to do the work now, the real work. of grieving, healing, moving forward. Please call me back. He hung up and stood there in the empty hallway, feeling lighter than he had in years, finally ready to stop running, finally ready to heal. Inside the room, Joyce had woken just enough to reach for her phone on the bedside table. Donald's photo filled the screen, his smile, his eyes, everything she'd loved about him, frozen in pixels and memory. For the first time, looking at that smile didn't bring crushing guilt. Instead, she could almost imagine him looking back at her with approval, with love, with the same generous heart that had made her fall for him in the first place. "I'll always love you," Joyce whispered to the image, her free hand resting on her belly where their son grew. "You gave me so much, Donald. This baby, the capacity to love, the strength to survive losing you. I'll make sure our son knows what an incredible man his father was." She paused, tears sliding down her cheeks, but continuing anyway. "But I think I'm allowed to love him too. Robert, I think you'd like him, actually. He's kind and he's broken like me, and he's trying so hard to be a good father to his daughter. And I love him. I love him, and I love you, and somehow both feel true." The photo didn't change, but Joyce felt something shift inside her chest. Permission. Forgiveness. The understanding that love was never meant to be hoarded or measured or doled out in finite quantities. When Robert slipped back into the room, Joyce reached for his hand immediately. He took it without hesitation, settling back into the chair beside her bed. "Stay," she asked softly. "Always," he promised. And as they sat there in the pre-dawn darkness, hands clasped, both carrying their dead and their living in equal measure, they finally began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were allowed to build something new without destroying what came before. The bedroom Robert chose for Joyce was on the ground floor, just off the main living area. Close enough for help if needed, but with enough privacy to feel like her own space. He'd spent the 2 days while she was still hospitalized, transforming it from a sterile guest room into something warm and lived in. Soft blue curtains, fresh flowers on the dresser, a comfortable reading chair by the window overlooking the garden. When Joyce saw it, being wheeled in by Robert's insistence despite her protests that she could walk, she stopped in the doorway and simply stared. "It's too much," she whispered. "It's necessary," Robert corrected gently. "Doctor's orders, bed rest, ground floor, close monitoring, and I'll be able to hear you if you need anything." Elma pushed past both of them, already claiming the reading chair as her own. "This is perfect. Now I can visit whenever I want, and we're not so far away." The delight on the little girl's face made any protest Joyce might have voiced die on her lips. She was installed in the bed like royalty, pillows arranged just so, the remote for the television placed within easy reach, a small bell on the nightstand that Robert insisted she use if she needed anything at all. "I'm not an invalid," Joyce protested weakly. "No," Robert agreed. "You're a woman growing a human being who needs to rest so that human being doesn't arrive before he's ready. There's a difference." Over the following weeks, they settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and remarkably natural. Robert worked from home, his laptop set up in the study, but his attention constantly drifting toward Joyce's room. Conference calls were interrupted by the sound of her laughter at something Elma said. Financial reports were reviewed with one ear listening for any sign of distress. Joyce directed the household from what she called her temporary throne, Mrs. Patterson checking in regularly for instructions about meals and household management. But mostly she rested, reading, napping, one hand always on her belly, feeling the baby's increasingly strong movements. Elma became a constant presence, bringing library books she thought Joyce would like, drawing elaborate pictures for the nursery they'd started preparing in the room adjacent to Joyce's temporary quarters. The little girl would climb onto the bed carefully, mindful of Joyce's belly, and chatter about school and friends and the 1,000 small dramas of a 7-year-old's life. They shared meals together now, all 3 of them around the small table in Joyce's room when she wasn't feeling up to the dining room, or in the kitchen when she was. Robert proved to be a surprisingly competent cook when motivated, and mealtimes filled with conversation and laughter in a way the house hadn't heard in years. The grief hadn't disappeared. Catherine's photos still graced the mantel in the living room, her smile frozen in happier times, and Donald's picture held pride of place on Joyce's nightstand, watching over her as she slept. But somehow, the presence of the dead didn't feel oppressive anymore. They were part of the story, honored and remembered, but no longer the only story being told. One evening, as Joyce was settling in for the night, Elma appeared in her pajamas, clutching her teddy bear. "Can I stay with you for a bit?" she asked shyly. Of course, sweetheart. Joyce shifted over, making room. Elma climbed in carefully, snuggling against Joyce's side, her small hand coming to rest on Joyce's belly. They lay in comfortable silence for a while before Elma spoke. Miss Joyce, if the baby is a boy, can you name him something that means love? Joyce's throat tightened. Why love, honey? Because that's what you and Daddy gave me back, Elma said simply. I forgot what it felt like. After Mommy died, everything was so sad and quiet and lonely. But then you came and everything got warm again. Like love came back to our house. Joyce had to close her eyes against the tears. You are the sweetest soul, Elma Buscher. So will you. Name him something about love. I'll think about it, Joyce promised, kissing the top of Elma's head. I'll think very carefully about it. Later that night, after Elma had been tucked into her own bed, Robert knocked softly on Joyce's door. She was still awake, propped up on pillows, one hand on her belly. Can we talk? He asked. Always. Robert pulled the reading chair closer to the bed, sitting so they were eye level. For a moment, neither spoke, and the silence was comfortable rather than heavy. I've been thinking about the future, Robert said finally. About what this is. What we're doing, where we're going. Joyce's hand stilled on her belly. And I want to do this right. Not rush, not assume, not put pressure on you when you're already dealing with so much. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. So I'm asking, what do you need from me, Joyce? What would make you feel safe and certain about this? Joyce considered the question carefully. Time, she said eventually, and the certainty that this is real. That we're not just two broken people clinging to each other because we're both drowning. I need to know that what we feel is solid, not just convenient grief management. Robert nodded slowly. That's fair. Completely fair. I'm not saying I doubt us, Joyce added quickly. I'm just saying I need to be sure. For my sake, for the baby's sake, for Elma's sake. We can't build something on a foundation of unprocessed grief and loneliness. Then we'll take time, Robert said simply. As much as you need. I'm not going anywhere, Joyce. I'll be right here, whether it takes weeks or months or years for you to be certain. I'm not going anywhere. The conviction in his voice made Joyce's eyes burn with tears. You mean that? With everything I am. The phone call came 3 days later, Donald's mother's name appearing on Joyce's screen for the first time in months. Joyce stared at it for 3 rings before answering, her heart in her throat. Mama Helen, she breathed. Baby girl. The older woman's voice was warm, familiar, achingly reminiscent of Donald. I've been thinking about you. Felt like something was pulling me to call. How are you? How's my grandbaby? And Joyce, who'd been holding herself together for weeks, broke down. Through tears, she confessed everything. The pregnancy complications, the collapse, moving into Robert's house, the feelings she'd been battling, the guilt that ate at her every day. She braced for judgment, for disappointment, for the condemnation she'd been inflicting on herself. Instead, after a long pause, Mama Helen said gently, Baby, Donald's last words to me before the accident were, take care of my Joyce, not make sure she stays alone forever. Not, don't let her move on. Just take care of my Joyce. Joyce's breath hitched. He loved you so much, baby girl, and because he loved you, he would want you taken care of. If this man, this Robert, is doing that, if he's loving you and that baby the way you deserve, then Donald would be grateful, not jealous, not disappointed. Grateful. You really think so, Joyce whispered. I know so. My son had the biggest heart of anyone I ever knew. You think he'd want his baby growing up without a father figure. You think he'd want you struggling alone when there's someone willing to stand with you. Mama Helen's voice broke slightly. You honor Donald by living fully, Joyce. By letting yourself be happy. By being the kind of mother to his son that he would have wanted. Joyful, not martyred. After they hung up, Joyce sat in the quiet of her room, one hand on her belly, the other clutching the phone. The baby kicked, strong and insistent, and she whispered, Did you hear that, little one? Your daddy's mama says we're allowed to be happy. Says your daddy would want that for us. That Saturday, Robert took Elma to visit Catherine's grave. It was a crisp autumn morning, on leaves scattering across the cemetery grounds in shades of gold and crimson. Elma held a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked from the garden, Catherine's favorites. They stood before the marble headstone together, Robert's hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Hi, Mommy," Elma said softly, placing the flowers at the base of the stone. "I miss you. I think about you every day." Robert cleared his throat, the words he'd been rehearsing all morning suddenly inadequate. "Catherine," he began, his voice rough, "I need to tell you something. There's someone. Joyce. She worked for us. She's pregnant, widowed, and somehow we've—" He stopped, started again. "I have feelings for her. Deep feelings, and I feel guilty about it every single day, like I'm betraying you, erasing you, replacing you." The wind picked up, rustling through the trees overhead. "But I found your letter," Robert continued, "the one you wrote before you got pregnant. And you gave me permission, Catherine. You told me to live, to love again. I'm trying to honor that. Trying to honor you by not dying with you." Elma tugged on his sleeve. "Can I say something?" Robert nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "Mommy," Elma said, her voice clear and certain, "I love you so much. I'll always love you. But I love Joyce too. She makes Daddy smile again. She makes our house feel warm. And I think you'd want Daddy to be happy again. Is that okay?" The wind blew harder, sending leaves dancing across the ground, and Robert felt something in his chest, the tight fist of guilt that had been clenched there for 3 years, finally begin to loosen. "I think it's okay," he whispered. And for the first time, he believed it. Back at the house, Robert found Joyce in the nursery adjacent to her bedroom. She was supposed to be resting, but she'd gotten up to fold the tiny clothes they'd been washing, onesies and sleepers in soft yellows and greens, gender neutral until they knew for sure. She was crying softly, and Robert's heart clenched in alarm. "Joyce, what's wrong? Is it the baby?" She looked up, startled, and shook her head. "No, nothing's wrong. That's what's so strange." She laughed through her tears. "For the first time since Donald died, nothing feels wrong. I feel happy, and I don't know if I'm allowed to feel that." Robert crossed the room and sat beside her on the floor, taking her hands in his. "You're allowed," he said firmly. "We're both allowed." Joyce looked at him, really looked at him, and saw everything she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. The love in his eyes, the hope, the fear that mirrored her own, the grief they both carried, and the possibility of joy they were both reaching for. Robert, Joyce, and finally, he leaned in and kissed her. Soft, tentative, both of them trembling with the enormity of it. It tasted of tears and hope and new beginnings, of grief acknowledged and love rediscovered, of two broken people deciding that maybe broken could still be beautiful. When they pulled apart, Joyce kept her eyes closed for a moment, savoring it. "I love you," she whispered. "And I loved him. And somehow both feel true." Robert rested his forehead against hers. "I love you. And I loved her. And I think they'd both understand." They sat there on the nursery floor, surrounded by tiny clothes and big possibilities, holding each other like the precious, fragile, miraculous things they were. Two people who'd lost everything learning that they could still build something new. Not a replacement family, not a second-choice life, but something honest and hard-won and entirely their own. Outside, the autumn wind scattered leaves across the lawn. Inside, something new was beginning, carefully, tenderly, with full hearts and open eyes. And somewhere, maybe, two souls who'd loved them watched and approved. The contractions started at 3 a.m., exactly 39 weeks to the day. Joyce woke Robert with a hand on his shoulder. He'd taken to sleeping in the chair beside her bed these past weeks, close enough to help, but respectful of the boundaries they were still carefully navigating. "It's time," she said, and the mix of fear and excitement in her voice had him wide awake instantly. By 4 a.m., they were at the hospital, Elma collected from her bed, still half asleep, but insisting she wouldn't miss this for anything. The little girl held Joyce's hand through the early contractions, talking to her belly and promising the baby that being born wasn't so scary, that there were so many people waiting to love him. The labor progressed steadily through the morning. Robert never left Joyce's side, his hand in hers, his voice steady even when hers wavered with exhaustion and pain. Elma dozed in the corner chair, waking periodically to check on progress with the solemn importance of someone with a vital job. At 2:47 p.m., after one final tremendous push, Donald Henry Jr. enter the world with a fierce cry that announced his arrival to anyone within earshot. Tiny, perfect, with a head of dark hair and his mother's nose, he was immediately the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen. "Would you like to cut the cord?" the doctor asked Robert, and Joyce nodded through her tears of joy and relief. Robert's hands shook as he made the cut, separating mother and son for the first time, allowing the baby to become fully his own person. When the nurse placed the cleaned and swaddled infant in his arms moments later, Robert looked down at the tiny face and felt his heart expand in ways he hadn't known were still possible. "Welcome to the world, little man," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've got a great mom, the best mom, and a big sister who can't wait to meet you properly. And a dad who loved you enough to let your mom love again." Elma had crept closer, standing on tiptoe to see the baby better. Her small voice corrected him with the gentle certainty of a child who saw truth more clearly than adults. "And a new dad who loves your mom and will love you too." Robert's eyes flew to Joyce, seeking permission for what Elma had just claimed. Joyce's face was wet with tears, happy ones this time, not born of grief, but of overwhelming joy. She nodded, unable to speak, and Robert felt the last wall around his heart crumble into dust. "Yes," he whispered to the baby, then louder, looking at Joyce and Elma both. "And a new dad who will love you all with everything he has." 1 month later, the photographer arranged them in the living room for family portraits. Baby Donald slept peacefully in Joyce's arms, his tiny fist curled around her finger. Elma stood beside Robert, his hand on her shoulder, all of them dressed in coordinated shades of blue and cream. "Beautiful," the photographer said, clicking away. "You're a lovely family." After she left, Joyce stood before the mantel, studying where the new portrait would hang. The space had been cleared, but she shook her head when Robert moved to take down the existing photographs. "No," she said firmly. "Leave them. Catherine in her wedding dress, Donald in his work uniform. They're part of this family too." So they arranged it together, the new portrait in the center, flanked on either side by the ghosts who'd made this moment possible. Catherine's smile seemed to bless them from her frame. Donald's eyes held only warmth and approval. And in the middle, a proof that love could survive the unsurvivable and bloom again in the most unexpected soil. That night, after Elma was tucked in and the baby sleeping in his bassinet, Joyce and Robert stood together before the mantel, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder. "Grief taught us what we could survive," Joyce said softly. The thought that had been forming for weeks finally finding words. "Love taught us what we could become. And in the end, we learned the most important lesson of all. The people we've lost don't live in our pain. They live in our capacity to love again." Robert pulled her closer. "Donald gave you that capacity. Catherine gave you that gift," Joyce continued. "And now we give it to our children," they said together, looking at the photographs, old and new, dead and living, all equally precious. Proof that love doesn't end. It just transforms, expands, and continues. "Always continues," Robert finished, turning to kiss her forehead. In the mantel's reflection, they could see it all. 4 people living, 2 people remembered, 1 family built from the ruins of 2, honoring the past while embracing the future. Not erasing what came before, but expanding to make room for what could still be. The baby stirred in his sleep, making the small sounds that would soon become demands for feeding. Upstairs, Elma's nightlight glowed softly, keeping watch over dreams where mothers in heaven and fathers on earth both smiled down with approval. And in this house that had known such profound grief, life bloomed again, messy and complicated and more beautiful for having been earned through tears and time and the courage to believe that broken hearts could still beat strong. Love didn't end. It just transformed, expanded, and continued, always. To all my amazing viewers, thank you. Every time you watch, like, and share my videos, you keep the echoes of love alive. Your support, your comments, and your time mean more than you know. This channel exists because of you. I appreciate you deeply.